You're good? Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start the meeting here. I'd like to welcome you all to our October Greater St. Paul Boma membership meeting. And Dave Ketchum, who's our board chair, is out of town on business today. I'm Jerry Hersman, former board chair. I'd like to welcome you all. Also those that are Zooming in, I can see you there. And we have an overflow crowd here at the Doubletree, 25 people perhaps, but it's exuberant, friendly group. So welcome everybody here today. Today is our annual office market report, which is an exciting topic for a lot of people. And we have some information to share with you that's hot off the press today. And what makes this a little bit unique and special, it's our 26th annual event on our office market report for downtown St. Paul. And if you look at other vendors that have their office market reports, they usually have a paragraph or a page on St. Paul. And ours is very detailed and covers a lot of information that the rest of them don't have. So we are kind of the St. Paul Boma, or the St. Paul office market study of information. The first report came out in November of '95. So joining us today on our call, in our meeting, we're gonna have Michael Broder with Brightline Strategies. He's out on the East Coast, and we'll talk a little bit more about him in a minute. But he's gonna be connecting to discuss research that his firm has been doing on behalf of Boma International. And they conducted the impact of the pandemic on commercial real estate. And it's a fascinating report that they put out based on an April study, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get closer to that time. Before we get started though, we do want to have a few items to take care of on our business meeting first. And the first is thanking our meeting sponsors, which is District Energy and Horizon Roofing. So please join me in a round of applause for them. Thank you. And we also have a prospective member with us today, Kevin Total with Content Studios. And back in the corner, thank you for joining us today and welcome. And I'd also like to introduce a new individual member on the building side, Jordan Hillstead. Raise up. Jordan Hillstead is a graduate of St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas this past spring, and had an internship with Fraunhofer Companies and joined us full time about a month ago, give or take. And we welcome you to the real estate industry and to Fraunhofer and to St. Paul Boma. So welcome there. Also like to have a note of appreciation for Denise and Samantha in the support of the Special Events Committee for pulling together today's mini expo. Which you saw on the front end before this meeting. There'll also be service providers that are at their booths on the outside here after the meeting. Similar to the last one we had in September at Lake Harriet for those that were able to make that meeting. It's been a tough year, as you can imagine, for our service providers. So we want to encourage you to go visit with them and talk to them about their services and products and get to know them a little bit better so they get to know you a little bit better. So thank you for being here, all the service providers that have a presentation there. And next up is Sonny Elliott with Faegre Drinker, who's giving us an update on the legislature. Sonny, welcome. What is going on at the Capitol? Can you keep it to an hour?
Yeah, I think I can probably handle that. Thanks, Jerry. You always make it possible for me to not have to tell a joke at the very beginning, which I appreciate, because most political jokes, they sometimes get elected. So, okay. Anyway, so in the last week, the legislature did meet for its 5th special session of the year, and that is very unusual. It's the most special sessions that I have heard about since I have been working at the Capitol. And the big joke around the Capitol is special sessions just aren't that special anymore. But particularly why we have to have this many special sessions this year is because the governor is working to keep his emergency peacetime authority powers so that he has something that he can use to put into place the restrictions that the state has on COVID, and also to allow for other opportunities for, like, the Department of Health or the Department of Human Services to waive some rules that they would normally use. So every 30 days he needs to renew those powers, and so he has to call the legislature back because they must be available at the time that he renews those powers in case they want to remove his powers. So the past 4 special sessions have been political shenanigans, and they haven't been able to do much productive, but twice they tried to pass some important legislation on bonding, and the third time seems to be the charm, because they tried again this time and they were able to pass almost $2 billion bonding bill. And some of the highlights of the items that Boma St. Paul cares about are $52 million to the city of St. Paul for the 3rd Street Kellogg Boulevard Bridge. And I know that that is something we have been very excited about to see come to fruition. Additionally, a couple other projects is that there was $29.5 million that went to the commissioner of the Department of Administration for the State Emergency Operations Center, and then another $170,000 to the Department of Administration for demolition of the Ford building. That wasn't all of the things that the Department of Administration wanted, or the state of Minnesota, but they did get a few of the items they were looking for. There was also supplemental spending of about $31 million, and among the highlights there were that about $11 million went to the various state agencies for funding for due to the civil unrest, and so to try to make up for some of those costs. Finally, there was a tax change, and that tax change was for the was expanding the 179 expense reimbursement for purchase and operating of large equipment, and this primarily helps larger businesses and also agriculture. So we can expect 2 more special sessions by January 5th, when the legislature goes back into session full time. November 3rd is the general election. If you haven't already voted, prepare to vote. 911,000 ballots have already been accepted by the Secretary of State, and that's out of 3,500,000 registered voters. So about 25%, which is a large number considering about 75% is what they expect for voter turnout based on history. So I will be back next month to fill you in post-election, and look forward to talking to you then. Thanks. Back to Jerry.
Thank you, Sonny. Appreciate your update as always. Nice job. So that concludes the business part of our meeting. Now we're going to move into the annual office market report presentation. Joe
Jerry,
and I.
There's one more announcement.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's not on your script? Oh, here, let me do it then. Okay. All right. So the pandemic has disrupted many things in our lives. Without getting into the laundry list of toilet paper and going to movies and what have you, one additional item has been the Boma Awards we typically hand out at the annual meeting, which would have been last April, of course. Now, we've had so few opportunities where we brought members together live this year to present the awards. We haven't really been able to do that. So we're trying to knock one of those off today because Jerry Hersman is here. All right. So Jerry, you stepped down as chair of the board last April, and we typically want to acknowledge when the board leader moves to immediate past chair. As president of Boma, I can tell you that Jerry was an excellent board chair. And I appreciated all the guidance and assistance he provided to me and the Boma staff. Jerry was always there when you needed him, whether you liked it or not. No.
whether you want it or not.
So Jerry, in these COVID times, rather than, hand you an award and shake your hand like we traditionally do, I want you to look under your podium, and you're going to see this box on that top shelf way in the back I hid from you. And if you could pull that out, open it up.
It's the one I bought for myself.
And then if you'd read the inscription on there.
Gotta find a background that'll let me to, okay. Boma, Greater St. Paul Building Owners and Managers Association recognizes and thanks Jerry Hersman in appreciation for significant service to the Greater St. Paul Building Owners and Managers Association as chairperson of the board for
2019 and 2020.
All right. Well, thank you, Jerry. I appreciate all you've done.
Yeah. That was very unexpected, Joe. Thank you. As Joe mentioned, I'm just going to be quick here. When I was last up here was about March 10th, give or take. And if you remember, March 17th, I think was when the
pandemic really took hold. Everything got shut down. And I was supposed to be back up here in April.
So I didn't have a chance to thank some people that I should have, because I didn't know at the time that I was done. But I want to thank all the committees and committee chairs that are the backbone and lifeblood of this organization, that contribute their time and services and expertise to making this organization so well run. I want to thank our board of directors that have eminent wisdom, not only in strategic planning and long-term thought, but who was really there making me look good over the years. I want to thank the office staff, Rhonda and Denise and Samantha here, and past people that have consisted. But I personally want to thank Joe, who is more than the president of the chapter. He's a friend. And I think back to a car ride we had in Scottsdale about 7 years ago. We were at the winter business meetings, and he said, "Hey, have you ever thought about being board chair, Jerry?" And my answer was no. in a lot of ways, I said no and no. But fast forward today, I want to just take this as an opportunity to thank people for the opportunity to have served you and get to know all of you better. So thank you very much.
All right. Hey, one other announcement. I don't know if you use a face mask.
Yes, we do have, anybody's interested that's here in the room, extra boxes of face masks at the front desk where you check in, and you're free to take a box or two on your way out if you need an extra supply. So we're trying to be as helpful to everybody in that front as we can. So thanks. So now we will start with our annual office market report presentation. And as I mentioned, this is our 26th anniversary, going back to November of 1995, six. But I want to thank Pat Wolf, who was the chair of the marketing and leasing committee that runs the initiative to put all this information together. So Pat Wolf, thank you very much. I don't know if you have any of your committee members here today in live. Those that are zooming in, raise your hands. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Rhonda and Samantha for their help and expert assistance in putting this report together, because it is not a simple task. So thank you. Let's have a round of applause for the people that put that together. So thank you. We all know this has been a very unusual year. The 26 years producing this report, we went through lots of ups and downs, market trends, the economy, both local and national, the commercial office market, but a pandemic that empties our buildings of tenants is simply a crazy different animal to try to deal with and get, just trying to get people to survive in the markets. We have no roadmap to this. We're all doing the best we can. Now, keep in mind that while Michael Broder, who's going to talk to us coming up here after this, is trying to peer into the future, our initiative is take a snapshot of where downtown has been over the past year and the past couple months, more remote or more recently. So, Joe, let's start our discussion. And for the Zoom viewers, feel free to enter any questions into your chat box, and we'll get to those as we can here. We'll address some of those questions and answers, and then those from the room, just raise your hand and we'll call on you as we go along here. So Joe, what does the downtown market look like right now?
Well, thanks, Jerry. So big picture wise, the downtown St. Paul universe right now is about 15.4 million square feet of office space. So we show it here subdivided among three different principal areas, of course, competitive, government, and owner occupied. So when we compare 2019 to 2020, it's really virtually identical at 15.4 million square feet. And the distribution between those three areas really is essentially unchanged.
So really, that's a pretty strong data point there that we've got some stability in the marketplace.
Yes, that's right, Jerry. In fact, the total competitive square feet number actually went up just a little bit. In 2019, it was about 7.41 million square feet. Now it's about 7.44 million square feet, an increase of about 30,000 square feet.
So obviously, it's easy to get lost in the numbers. Is there a rationale on how that happened in this pandemic?
Yeah, so the market is like, a person taking breaths. When they inhale, they expand. When they exhale, they contract. Well, then downtown market is really the same way. So the market contracted a little bit when it lost space. And probably the most clear example of that is Cray Plaza, when it was purchased by Bigos Management, and it's now being converted over to residential space. Balancing this, though, is when some space in downtown had been earmarked for residential use in our report last year in 2019, and it's now flipping back into office usage. And of course, I'm talking about the First National Bank building, the East Tower, specifically the First National Bank building. So when we take, into account these changes, all the other various examples that are smaller, we weigh it all out, then overall the total competitive space inched up a little bit.
So Joe, one of the metrics we use to measure activity in the marketplace is the office space absorption. Can you talk a little bit about what absorption is and what impact over the past year we've seen of any trends in the absorption in the market?
Sure. Absorption is one of those more arcane measures, but it really is a measure of the increase or decrease in occupied office space. It's pretty simple and compared from one year to the next. Now, we've recently changed how we measure absorption in our market report. The old way included buildings that had left the market. Starting this year, the Marketing and Leasing Committee decided to not include them since that loss is already being tracked when we measure the universe, okay? So now we are only including buildings that are actually leasing space. And in looking at these, did the competitive market go up or down in space, all right? So with this report, we are showing a positive absorption of about 166,000 square feet in the overall market. This is a huge improvement over past years. Now, just to compare apples to apples, Jerry, if we still use the old method of measuring absorption, it would have been probably about flat for the year instead of the increase that we're looking at. And that would still be a huge improvement over the trend line of the past 3 years where there was significant negative absorption.
So Joe, it's easy to get lost in the total universe because you got owner-occupied government in there. Well, let's focus on the competitive market for a little bit because that's such a more dynamic market. First off, can you talk a little bit about any trends you've seen in the vacancy rates?
Well, let's look, first of all, if we're going to talk vacancy, let's look at the entire universe to start with. And we right now are at about 9% vacancy compared to a little over 10% in 2019. So we were able to make positive progress there, Jerry.
Okay, so again, that's the universe. Do you have statistics on the competitive market you can share with us?
Oh, I guess if I have to. So the overall competitive market vacancy rate in downtown has improved. It dropped to 18.6%. This compares to 21.1% in 2019. So this was a healthy step in the right direction.
So what's driving that decrease in vacancy?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the individual classes to really see what's going on. So as you can see, with both A and B, vacancy rates fell. A went down a little bit, B was more significant.
So wow, so B really did drop. Looks like it went from what, 26.6 to 21.1%. That's a pretty significant drop in vacancy rates. Do you have explanation for that?
Sure. A few of the B buildings made some headway on leasing, but really the biggest impact was moving Cray Plaza out of the report, which had a very high vacancy rate. C actually crept up a little bit in its vacancy rate, but given that really B dominates the market, it's almost half the market, then even a little bit of backsliding on C didn't really damper the overall improvement in the competitive market for vacancy rate.
Okay, one of the questions I just saw pop up here, maybe there's more that we can get to, but I just want to maybe, because it's significant here, is the time frame that we're measuring the data over. Are these as of July 1st? The trend is over the past year, July 1 to July 1? Is that?
No, typically we try to cut it off around Labor Day.
Okay.
You know, sometimes a little bit of data sneaks in a little bit late, but you know, if you had to put a timestamp on it, you know, we like to say it's around Labor Day, so the beginning of September, that we're measuring it from 1 year to the next.
Okay, so hopefully that answers the viewer's question. Thank you, Joe. And obviously there's a correlation between vacancy rates and rental rates. And when we see markets tighten, we tend to see rates go up. And with the increase in occupancy and decrease in vacancy, are you seeing any trends in the actual rental rates?
So here are the numbers for gross 2020 rates by class. Now, if we compare gross rates by class this year versus last year, there is an uptick for both A and B. A increased from 25 to 26, a little bit. B jumped from 18 to 22. C, on the other hand, pulled back slightly from around 21 in 2019 to about $19 this year. And, you know, based upon what we saw with the vacancy rate, this kind of mirrors that trend where A and B, vacancy went down, the rates went up. C, the vacancy went up a little bit and its rates went down slightly.
Okay, Joe, that's a great snapshot, I think, of the commercial office market. One of the other aspects of our downtown vibrancy is the residential market. Have you seen any changes in the residential growth or a contraction?
Yeah, so, you know, this may feel like a broken record because we've been reporting this now for, you know, multiple years, but the growth in downtown St. Paul residents continues really unabated. Thanks to Mary Bugeaud with Maxfield Research, who conducts our residential survey, we have a very good read on what's going on. Well, last year we reported the downtown population had jumped to 9,845, or just a hair under 10,000. This year, we broke that hurdle. We are now at 10,298 residents in downtown St. Paul. So if you measure that from 2010 to 2020, so we got a full decade there, that's a 112% increase in growth. So as we reported last year, St. Paul is one of the leaders in downtown population growth across the country.
Joe, that's a pretty impressive report this year. I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank again Pat Wolf and the Marketing and Leasing Committee for helping put the report together. The full report is going to be available and posted on the St. Paul Boma website later this afternoon, I believe. Is that correct?
It's there right now.
And it's there now.
Yep.
And the source there is spdatasource.org. spdatasource.org, where you can pull that full report out and have it for your own files. So that concludes our market report for 2020, and we'll open it up to questions. Samantha, are there some online? Okay, so I don't see any new ones. Anybody in the room have any questions they want to ask? It was all so well presented. There's no questions. You've answered every one of your questions. Well, given that, we will move along to our feature presenter here today. And joining us online, if you can technologically connect them there, we're going to bring in Michael Broder with Brightline Strategies. And I actually had the opportunity to listen to Michael in June, I believe it was, online at the World Conference of Boma International, who gave this presentation. And when Joe and I were talking about kicking around ideas for this show, it's like, you know, this guy Boma hired is pretty knowledgeable on what the impact of pandemic has been in the commercial office market. And it's not just the market itself. He drilled down to big users, little users, industrial, commercial, all sorts of types of users. And what it's not just the landlords, it's what the tenants are thinking about as they're going through their own decision processes. So Michael and his team did a full April study for segments of the East Coast, but they're relevant nationally. And given the success of that study, Boma International has contracted with them to do further studying this past summer which is just wrapping up now. And so the benefit to all of us, we're not going to get the full details because it hasn't been presented even to Boma International yet. But I think there's enough information that's been gathered for Michael to share with us that it can tell us if this is a, the tenants' needs in the office market, if these are going to be blips, or if they are truly transformative in our industry in terms of where people want to be working. Is it completely offsite? Want to go back to the office? What it is? So, Michael, we'll welcome you here if you can join us.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. I appreciate it. And Joe, thank you for the opportunity to speak with everybody. I'm joined today with one of my colleagues, Kevin Hudak, who runs our research division. And Kevin will be taking over the presentation in a few minutes to walk you through several of the findings that we uncovered in our initial study. One of the things that I wanted to just build upon Jerry's comments is that this study that we're going to share with you today was initially run at the height of what I'll call the panic part of the pandemic. In other words, this study was fielded in April of this year, and it began to really provide some context and understanding around what are the actions that decision makers within various portfolios are taking with respect to their own businesses. How are they preserving continuity of operations? What measures are they putting into place to ensure that they come out the other side in a position of strength, or at least of survival? And what does that mean from the real estate landscape? In other words, how are these decisions that tenants are making, tenant decision makers are making, impacting the industry in real time and over the horizon? As Jerry mentioned, we are in the process right now of processing a follow-on study. So this initial study led to a series of nationwide studies, the first which just completed over the weekend, with nearly 3,000 tenant decision makers drawn from across the country with oversampling in the top markets. That data will be publicly released in November in partnership with Boma International and Yardi. We will give you some insights today on some of the more interesting trends we've seen emerge from the existing study that we are going to share with you today as it relates to the nationwide. It is a fascinating set of information. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin Hudak to begin to walk you through the findings of the initial study. And as we proceed through this conversation, we will certainly share with you some of the trend lines that we're seeing from a nationwide standpoint. The point here, and the way to look at this data, because this is a little different type of research than what I think is done traditionally in real estate. Our backgrounds, myself, Kevin, and everybody who works at Brightline, came out of the political world. So we tend to apply political research methodologies, which are all primary audience research methodologies, to the real estate space to understand what the drivers of behaviors and decisions are. And you're going to see how those considerations that tenants are thinking about every day, what it's led them to do and prepare for, and what that means for the real estate industry. So it's a pretty robust set of data. We will move through it as quickly as we can. But I would also encourage questions as we go, because we believe in dialogues, not monologues. So with that, Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you. I will go on mute, although I may pop in for color commentary here and there. But Kevin, without further ado.
Excellent. Well, Mike, thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you to St. Paul Boma for having us on today. Really appreciate it. And like Mike said, I'll be monitoring, and Mike will be monitoring the Q&A boxes and the chat boxes as we go through. So feel free to submit some questions, but we'll also have some time after the presentation to answer some of your questions specifically, quote unquote, on the air. But just to jump right in, and what Mike said is true, that this study was conducted in April to May of 2020. But I think that a lot of the question structures that we're looking at, as well as the responses that you see from sort of the height of the quote unquote panic around the pandemic are really meaningful, and we'll integrate some of the new data that we're hearing as part of that phase 2 study as we go throughout. And you should definitely all remain on the lookout for early November when we release the results of that phase 2 study. So for this phase 1 study back in April and May, this reflects about 365 responses collected from commercial office decision makers in the Mid-Atlantic. And still those results are relevant nationwide. I would say that everyone who is in this study has either decision-making authority for their real estate decisions, or they are high-level influencers. So by that, they're on a board or a committee that decides where to locate office spaces, or they're the main points of contact with the real estate companies as well. As we go through this, you'll also see that we stratify the data by industry, by square footage, by even rent per square foot that these tenants are paying. So you'll see some interesting trends there, all of which you'll see in that phase 2 study as well. And to Mike's point, really our objective was not just to understand things like tenant satisfaction, or things like what that snapshot in time looks like of who's in their office and why. Right? We wanted to be a bit predictive. We wanted to have some foresight here. And so we're really looking at their underlying business dynamics. You'll see some numbers that we present, what we call the financial barometer, really trying to assess what are some of the underlying business realities that have been affected by the pandemic that might then influence their space decisions. And then of course we get to the nitty gritty. Well, what impact does this have on your space decisions? Are you reassessing your space? Would you reduce your square footage? And what does the work from home model look like for your organization? So pay attention to that as we go through, and we'll jump right in with that office tenant financial barometer that I just mentioned before. And again, the way that we ask this question is not just, is this currently affecting you? You'll see below that dark red bar is, this applies to us today. The blue bar is, this could apply to us in the future based on what we're seeing today. That dark gray bar is, it doesn't or won't apply. So first off, what really screams off the page to me is that top bar, where we show that as of May, about 70% of those tenant companies that we had interviewed experienced at least a 25% dip in revenue relative to forecast. Now, what I would add too is that we are promising these respondents confidentiality and anonymity as they're taking this online survey and responding to us. We also did a number of one-on-one interviews and focus groups that informed what we were asking, right? So there's a level of candor and sort of that they're not afraid to share some of this information with us because they know it's not necessarily going to be individually reported back to their landlords. And that's why you see this data, 70% saying we've experienced at least a 25% dip in revenue relative to forecast. You'll see those two bottom lines, 55% of tenants were saying that either it applies to us today or it could apply, that we'll struggle to meet payroll requirements, right? And most important for some of these commercial real estate companies is that bottom line. We've struggled to pay our office rent on time or meet our lease terms. 21% at that point had said it applies to us today. 33% said it could apply to us in the future. So that results in about 54% of office tenants saying that they are or could be struggling to pay their rent on time. What I would say is in our current study that we're fielding on behalf of Boma and Yardi, these numbers have remained fairly stable. So even though we have now been about 6 to 8 months later in this pandemic, we're still seeing those trends of that struggle to pay rent on time, struggling to meet payroll, staying fairly consistent, right? So while other things in the survey have changed pretty significantly, some of those underlying business dynamics remain the same. There hasn't been that upward boost in confidence, despite some of the stimulus packages, PPP, et cetera, that came through. So definitely keep that in mind as you're speaking with some of your tenants, as you're looking at the industry as a whole. We also wanted to understand what are some of the behaviors, attitudes, actions, and reactions that tenants are considering. What you'll see is, so for example, we've applied for small business emergency loans. So we have about 2/3 who say that that applied to them today or could apply to them. The one that I really paid attention to is that middle one. Based on our experience thus far with the health emergency, we're seeing less value in our physical office space than we have before, right? And that's 62% of office tenants at that point who said that they are seeing less value or they could be seeing less value based on the pandemic. And when you look at who's really driving those less value attitudes, it's initially not necessarily owners, presidents, and C-suite. It's more the VPs and directors of real estate, right? They jump up 10 points back in April and May to 72% less value. The tech industry as well. So folks who often already had a work from home contingent or have the tech savvy to immediately jump into those remote work situations, right? And then I would say the offices in the 25,000 to 50,000 square foot level is really what you want to pay attention to for that less value in the physical office space. They're sort of on the cusp of being a much larger company, a much larger user, but they're in that middle space where it's not necessarily as important to have that large office space. What this all means, though, and why this is useful for commercial real estate decision makers like those of you on the call today is really when we split it up, right? And again, this was almost about 400 surveys for this phase 1 study. As Mike said, we're doing about 3,000 surveys for this phase 2 study that we'll be releasing soon. So when you look at this, this is really how we look at the world when we break up these responses. And imagine when we have this phase 2 data back, these crosstabs, what we call crosstabs, will be even more robust. But for now, what we're looking at, imagine, is that red bar are folks who say we're seeing less value in physical office space, right? That applies today or it could apply, right? That blue bar is the same thing, applies today or could apply, but for the struggling to pay rent on time or meet their lease terms. So what this is telling you is that technology companies, 82% of them are seeing less value in their physical office space. 60% of them are struggling to pay rent on time and meet their lease terms, or they could be struggling in the future. Look at the professional services industry. That number drops to 58% and 47%. What we think is that that red bar, seeing less value in physical office space, is sort of the leading indicator. So technology companies are not really more likely or less likely to be struggling to pay rent on time, right? That blue bar, but they do have that high seeing less value in their physical office space. So that's a bit worrisome because it shows that they're kind of leading the trend on seeing less value, and that will eventually start cascading into either struggling to pay rent on time or really not wanting to pay as much rent for the space that they're getting. We also broke that out into geographic risk profiles. So in our Mid-Atlantic study, you can see where those attitudes are really coming from, their property location, whether it's urban or suburban urban even, or rural, and then the square footage. What's interesting about the square footage is that you do see that 25,000 to 50,000 square foot users jumping up for that seeing less value in the physical space. And you really see the smallest and the largest having a bit less of that struggling to pay rent on time. So some of those larger mature companies, less likely to be struggling to pay rent on time, as are those smaller companies that don't really have that much office space. But you'll also see in that rent per square foot analysis that the higher rent per square foot, the less value they're seeing in their physical office space. So we've heard stories here in the DC metro area. We've interviewed commercial tenant decision makers who have Class A trophy office spaces, but they have a law firm where a partner got sick and everyone went into isolation, and working from home was almost just as productive as being in the physical office space itself. And they're wondering, well, why don't we maintain a smaller footprint in our CBD and have a lot of the back end high square footage work off in a suburban or urban area, right? And so that's what we're seeing here in the DC metro area and in some of those larger CBDs across the country. But again, what you'll be seeing when we release the data in November, and we hope to visit with you all again with some of the specific greater St. Paul Twin Cities data that we're collecting, is really the breakdown by industry and rent per square foot is kind of defining the direction of the pandemic and how it's impacting the real estate industry. Mike referenced this before, but we wanted to ask a question just to get a baseline on our commercial space decision maker respondents is coronavirus, is the pandemic just a temporary blip, right? And even though we're going to be changing things for 6 to 12 months, or things will return to normal? Or is this a true transformation? Is this a true inflection point in workplaces where teleworking will be the new normal and the way that our company does business will not be the same for some time to come? Looking back to April to May, when we first conducted this phase 1 study, we had a 57% response for coronavirus as an inflection point. It will transform workplaces. Since we fielded that study, that number has gone up by about 6 to 7 points, which shows you that this is not necessarily decelerating, that folks are not saying that this is more a temporary blip as we get into this, right? There's more of those transformational attitudes, right? And the folks who are driving the transformational attitudes, whether it was our first phase study or now the second phase study, are really those larger square footages and the higher per square foot rents, right? They're the ones who are most likely to recognize the transformative effects here, as are the technology and manufacturing industries as well. And you'll see that we broke down the crosstabs on the right. We won't go through each one of them, but you'll see highlighted where the transformation numbers rose, where the temporary blip numbers rose as well. A big one is that 10,000 and 50,000 square foot user and those higher per square foot rents. I'd also say that the C-suites and owners are still, at least in that April to May study, we're still sort of waiting it out and seeing what this really looked like. It was more of your VPs, SVPs of real estate, your director level folks. 70% of them said that this would be a transformation, and that number has been going up into our phase 2 study. So it's not necessarily the main economic buyer, the leaders of these companies who are saying this is transformative. It's the day-to-day real estate folks who are VPs and directors who are managing some of these accounts, who are the main points of contact, who are more likely to recognize those transformative effects. We're not going to spend too much time on this slide, but really we wanted to understand back in April to May, and we've now updated this in our phase 2 study, really what was the projected impact on the time horizon for coronavirus. And I would just say that the dark blue bar is this will end or this will occur by July 2020. The light blue bar is August to September 2020. The green bar is where we are today, October to December 2020. And that dark gray bar is 2021 or later. Now, the first thing I would say is some of our commercial office tenant decision makers are not necessarily economists and finance types. You'll see at the bottom that stock market recovery to 25,000. We essentially had a majority of the samples saying it was going to occur later than August 1st. And as you know, we pretty much achieved that in advance of, in August or just before in July, right? But the other ones, so for example, peak of cases increasing in your region. A lot of folks thought that would occur by July 2020. 2/3 said that the peak of cases increasing in my region would occur by then. But as we're seeing now with phase 2 or phase 3 of coronavirus, that peak hasn't necessarily really been hit or achieved nationwide. The one to really pay attention to is that resumption of normal in-person office operations. And that's where we had about 55% of the sample saying that it would occur later than August 1st at that point. When you look at our current study, right now, obviously we kind of hip checked these timelines out. But when you look at our current study, more than 4 in 10 of the respondents in the current study see that resumption of normal in-person office operations not happening until Q1 2021, right? And almost a quarter are saying the resumption of normal in-person office operations won't happen until Q2 2020 or beyond. So we're looking at a large group of folks, and you've seen it in the news as well with some of these big companies saying that we're shifting from January 2021 more to June, July 2021. And we're seeing that in the national numbers in this recent phase 2 study, right? So one of the things that we've been working on with Boma and Yardi is understanding how can the commercial real estate industry, how can office owners and operators really go on the offense and work to enhance some of their services and features to facilitate safe and productive reopenings, but also really stand and message on the safety and the necessity of in-person and physical office spaces that are safely managed, right? And we've heard a number of anecdotes from CEOs and other C-suite and owners about what sort of messaging can they use and what sort of features and benefits can they provide to their employees to make them comfortable to come back. We've also heard from a number of millennial and Gen Z employees in Fortune 100 and 500 companies and small businesses saying that it's important for them to resume those in-person office operations because they see mentorship, right, in the in-person office environment. They see the opportunity to elevate themselves in their organization and get the training and skills development that they need. Right. So there is a balance to be had there. And I think both sides of organizations, the decision makers and the team and the employees kind of understand that. And it's all about doing that in the safest and most productive way possible, which we touch on towards the end of this survey and we'll discuss.
Kevin, I'd like to just add one point here. One of the reasons why the time horizon factor is very important, obviously, both in terms of just the impact it has on the sense of community certain buildings perhaps provide for its tenancy, but the bigger challenge is if you think about how difficult it was to lock down the environment itself, in other words, to move people out of the work environment and to work from home, the longer the pandemic goes, the more challenging it becomes to bring them back. And we've seen that in this initial study data and several other what I'll call behavioral analyses around the psychology of the workplace, if you will. And so obviously understanding what levers real estate owners and operators have at their disposal to help encourage a return to work, certainly done in the safest, most expeditious manner possible, but at the same time recognizing that the longer this goes, the harder it becomes to bring people back, not just for the owners and operators of the assets, but for the actual individual companies. There's all sorts of stories, if you've been following the news, about return to work in Manhattan and other cities, and the challenges that people are finding to bring their employees back, because now we are, as creatures of habit, becoming used to and being more conditioned to remote work. So there is these constant push and pull factors that we need to be mindful of as we consider what the future environment may yield and may ultimately look like.
Yeah, and we had a question come in from an attendee, is the time horizon being driven by the release of a vaccine? And I do think that that definitely factors into it for sure. In our current study that we're running, the phase 2 study, we don't necessarily ask about when they predict a vaccine will be available, since that's a very volatile timeline topic. I mean, already we've seen about 2 of those candidates go into, pauses essentially. So it's very tough to ask survey questions about vaccines, just like they didn't really have consistent views on the Dow returning to 25,000. What I would say though, is that we're looking at a very polarized environment. We asked a question in the phase 2 study, do you see the coronavirus COVID-19 public health emergency heading in the right direction or down the wrong track? And those right direction and wrong track views are split almost equally. So, which also kind of mirrors to some extent the larger public as well. So, we're looking at there may be some optimists amongst these commercial tenant decision makers. There may be some pessimists, but there's definitely some polarization. And I imagine that really affects the sort of psychology of safely reopening offices and their time perspectives. So just to jump into what this really means for commercial tenant decision makers and their decisions to renew their leases, since that is super important in addition to some of the space reassessments that we'll get to in a couple slides. But right now, we asked the question of them before we even mention coronavirus, right? In this phase 1 study, we ask, are you currently planning to renew your lease, right? When you look at the response, about 63% said yes on that renewal question. And again, before, it's clean, unbiased at the very top of the survey. This is interesting only in so that typically when we do commercial real estate office decision maker research, so from 2014 to 2020, our average renewal, yes, I would renew our office lease, was at about a 78%. Right? So we took about a 15-point hit, at least in the Mid-Atlantic in this phase 1 study, based on coronavirus, essentially, right? Going from 78% yes to 63% yes. I would say that it would be typically tough to make that comparison, but in our current office study that we're doing, that phase 2 study, that 63% has remained fairly stable. And the crosstabs that you see on the right amongst who is saying what remain stable as well. You have your 1,000 to 5,000 square foot users, so those smaller businesses who are really dragging down that yes on renewal. They're the ones who are a bit more transient. They have a bit more flexibility and mobility when it comes to their office space. They could maybe peel off some of their office space to co-working environments, either to increase the size of their footprint for social distancing and physical distancing, or if they are struggling financially and just want to enter a more flexible arrangement, right? And I would say that really it's the larger tenants, so the 50,000 plus and the higher per square foot rents, who are really driving that renewal focus. So when you look at your own portfolios, when you look at your own properties, taking into account some of this data in terms of who should we really be getting ahead of on conversations around renewal, what might we have to make some of these concessions, data like this can be super helpful. And as I said, we'll be providing that full set of 3,000 responses in early November. What I would say, that's a bit uncontrollable, that sort of clean question that we asked at the front. But what we're going to talk about now are some of the actions and what's under consideration by tenants to adapt. We won't spend too much time on this slide, but really the way this question was asked is, which of these behaviors, activities, or programs would be on the table, and that's red? Which of them are actually in process, and that's blue? Which are complete, and that's green? Or which are kind of off the table, would not be considered, and that's that dark gray that you see. We've sorted this by the sum of on the table, in process, or complete, right? So things that are more realistic. So take a look at what really rises to the top there. Reducing capital expenditures, right? We have about 74% saying that would be, or 77% saying that would be on the table, in process, or complete. Developing more stringent work from home guidelines and policies. All of those things that you see on the top are a bit less focused on commercial office owners and operators, right? Less impact there. The ones towards the bottom, right, while less necessarily realistic or being achieved today, right, they are more of that owner-operator impact. So imagine shifting square footage or offices to co-working or work share environments like WeWork, Industrious, and Regus, right? You see there that 43% are considering shifting square footage to co-working spaces, or are at least 12% say that some of that is even complete. We have going delinquent on their office lease or rent payments. Right there, 35% are either considering or in the process of going delinquent on their office lease and rent payments, right? So those are the ones that we really want to pay attention to. Also that 30% breaking our office lease and moving out, right? And even in one of the, in our office property, we have neighbors across the hallway who essentially broke their office lease and moved out. We're looking into this in the phase 2 study to really see where we projected back in April and May, what does that look like today, right? And did we see that shifting of square footage to WeWork, Regus, Industrious? Did we see some of that going delinquent on office lease and rent payments? What we've heard in presenting this data to associations and property owners nationwide is that some of them did not see that necessarily based on market realities. Others have seen even a little bit more severe than what we had found back in April and May. Just moving on, and this is one of the slides that I really like because I mentioned before that some of that renewal, just looking at renewal overall without the context of coronavirus, without the context of what property owners and operators have done, is kind of like uncontrollable. But what I like to say is that this is where we as an industry sort of control the controllables. When you look at it on the left, you see what we call the State of the Union. This was a straight read question that we asked: do you approve or disapprove of your office landlord's coronavirus response? Right? On this question, we have 70% who said that they approve of their landlord's response, right? And I would say in our phase 2 study, we've actually gone up by about 6 to 8 points on approval of landlords' responses to coronavirus. So we're moving in a great direction on that front. On the right, you'll see that bar where we essentially ask, just exclusively based on their response to coronavirus, does that make you more likely or less likely to renew your lease when it's up? On that one, you'll see we have about 44% who said more likely, and only 14% who said less likely. And that would be areas, I imagine, where landlords have either dropped the ball, not necessarily made concessions. There's been coronavirus cases in the building that they weren't made aware of. Those would be sort of the extremes. Now, some of you may be asking on the other end of the Zoom, then, why is it 77%, 70% approve, and yet 44% are more likely to renew their lease, right? Because sometimes that coronavirus response just doesn't factor into their, what we call in politics, their reason to vote, right? What I would say is that 44% more likely on the commercial side, when we ran this same study amongst multifamily apartment community residents, because we have a number of clients on the residential side, that was actually a 70% approve of their apartment community landlords, but only about 21% say it would make them more likely to renew, right? So there's a lot more stickiness that commercial owners and operators are building with their current tenants on the basis of the strength of their coronavirus response. So what's contributing to this? In the middle, you'll see that 78% of the respondents in our sample said that their landlord is communicating just the right amount on coronavirus. Only 14% said too little. I know as an office tenant, it makes me comfortable when our owner operator can, sends an email saying that there's been a coronavirus case, in our property, right? Thankfully not in our personal building, but they actually track where that patient or where that coronavirus case was in the office building. They don't give away PII, but they say what elevators, what garage they were parking in. And just that level of transparency and accountability definitely impresses me personally. I'd also say another contributing factor that you all should be aware of, for about 2 years now, we have been seeing safety and security rise to the top of commercial office tenant decision makers' minds when it comes to selecting one office property over another. Typically, you would see things more like rent and fees. You would see OpEx transparency. You would see the location itself, access to public transit, all sort of surmounting safety and security. But coronavirus has definitely cemented safety and security as the number 2 most important factor for these tenant decision makers, following only rent and price, essentially. I'd also say that 45%, if you see that bottom number, 45% of the tenant decision makers we spoke with are actually seeing more value in personal relationships with their property management staff as a result of coronavirus. So again, that's how we're building stickiness in the industry with those customers versus that multifamily study that we did, where really our efforts were not being rewarded with more renewal ROI, essentially. Looking forward, we asked this question, and this is where it really comes down to some of the nitty-gritty of space and square footage. We asked these commercial tenant decision makers, based on the coronavirus pandemic, how likely are you to reassess your space needs, whatever that may mean? We kind of drill into what that means in the next question on the next slide. But back in April and May, 51% said that they're likely to reassess their space needs as a result of coronavirus. And I would say this number has actually gone up in our phase 2 study, right? And when you look at it from market to market, it's gone up anywhere from 4 to 12 points, looking at it when you get a bit more granular like that. I'd also say that this jumps up, if you look on the right, amongst those who say coronavirus is a transformation, 61% of them say that they're likely to reassess their space needs. But even if they say it's a temporary blip, so even if you're a commercial office tenant decision maker who says this too shall pass, you still have about half of them saying that they're going to be reassessing their office space needs. So they recognize that this is a moment to negotiate, to optimize, and to really address their office space and their suites based on the coronavirus pandemic, even if they don't think this is a transformative event. So I would keep that in mind as portfolio and property owners and operators, as you're approaching some of these tenants. Even if you hear that they're not so concerned about coronavirus, they're still looking at it as a moment to address their space utilization. So what exactly does this mean? So if you said, I'm either likely or I'm unsure, right, when it comes to reassessing my space needs. So remember, that's about 75% of the sample said I'm likely or unsure about reassessing space needs. We asked only those folks, well, what does that mean? Are you going to expand space? Are you not going to change your square footage? Or are you going to reduce? And you see the intensity of the reductions below. So 60% of those asked would actually reduce their square footage. Now, when you look at that, essentially 60% of 75%, that comes to 45% of all tenants in our sample said that they would reduce square footage as a result of coronavirus. And you can see where that jumps. On the right, you'll see that 45%, well, if that's a 1,000 to 5,000 square foot user, they're at 38% would reduce. If they're a 10,000 to 25,000 square foot user, 57% of them would reduce. And if they're a 25,000 to 50,000 square foot user, 71% of them would reduce. And remember, that 25,000 to 50,000 square foot user is sort of the sweet spot, or the most sensitive spot, right? Because earlier, remember, they were more likely to say that this is a transformation. They were more likely to say that they're struggling to pay rent. So that's where that really top pain point is. And when you ask them about what that means, it's reducing the private office numbers and the sizes of private offices. It's reducing the size of their common areas. And some of those larger firms, the more than 50,000, are looking at adding in hoteling desks, reducing their conference rooms, even going to a more spread open floor plan, right? Spreading workers out to maintain that 6 to 8 feet of physical distance while reducing some of that excess space from the private offices and conference rooms. So we also, in addition to just talking about some of that square footage reduction, and I know on that square footage reduction, Mike often makes the point that it will be a bit of a challenge because you'll have multiple tenants peeling off small sections. So when we say reduce square footage, that's not necessarily that a 10,000 to 25,000 square foot user is going to go out of business or reduce their square footage by more than half. Remember, if you look at this bottom row here, only about 9% of users would actually reduce their square footage by more than half. The challenge, though, is you're going to have a lot of tenant companies that are looking to peel off maybe 10% of their workspace, 20% of their workspace. And so that means you're going to have a lot of smaller vacant areas in the building on different floors. And that's where that challenge comes into, what does this look like when you're actually trying to then lease that space out to other entities to reduce vacancy in those buildings? We're not going to focus too much on this slide because I do want to leave ample time for Q&A, but we asked tenant decision makers, where do you see more value or less value in this post-coronavirus world, ultimately? We asked them to think through, imagine at some point, coronavirus has been well managed, under control. To that question earlier, a vaccine has been developed. This is sorted by more value, right? The red bar is more value strongly, the blue bar is more value somewhat. Notice what's at the top: restaurants and neighborhood with delivery, personal relationships with the landlord and property management staff. Those are all increasing in value. Whereas things like social spaces and buildings, so the lounges and rooftop decks, the gym and fitness center, so fully 34% of those office tenants say they would see less value in the gym and fitness center on site. 36% said about the same, right? When you look at who's driving that, for example, less value in gyms and fitness, it's a lot of those middle square footages, the 5,000 to 25,000 square feet. It's the lower per square foot rents. So it's important, and we'll be updating this for our phase 2 study to see where are tenants really seeing more value and less value. For this slide, we also asked tenant decision makers, what are some of the features and positioning you'd like to see in programming in properties as a result of coronavirus? And these are more of the short-term ones. These are sort of things that most office owners and operators are looking at today and conducting today. So obviously the most popular, twice daily full office sanitization and disinfecting, and then 1 month rent deferral. So we had heard a lot about that, struggling to pay rent or some of those financial difficulties. Obviously, as a result, that's some of the most positive reactions that we get in terms of features that landlords could be offering. We also heard a lot about on-site health and wellness advisors. In the interviews and focus groups that we conducted, that on-site health and wellness advisor with screening or referral authority for symptoms, that came up in our interviews. We tested it in the survey. It tested about mid-range. That's not necessarily having a registered nurse on the office premises to advise and consult with tenants. That would be sort of a very deep liability issue. It's more having somebody from the portfolio or from the property who's kind of the liaison, right? Who's informing tenants about potential cases in the property. If a tenant has questions about resources that are available, or I had an employee ask me what percentage of our HVAC system is pulling in fresh air right now. It's someone knowledgeable to do that, and also maybe have maps printed out where, for tenant employees, you can direct them to the nearest coronavirus testing center, or tell them, is an insurance card going to be necessary for this? What will you be paying for this? It's giving as many resources and knowledge transfer as possible to those tenant employees. I'd also say we tested some long-term features and services as well. These, I would say we're retesting some of these in the survey, but these did not necessarily perform as intensely as some of those short-term services. The ones that I'd focus on, that emergency relocation services in the event of physical threats or biohazards, right? So having an ability to move tenant offices around the building or to different properties in order to keep continuity of operations, that's something that we've heard that is super important. And we've also been digging more into the dedicated teleworking boardrooms with reliable high-end AV and IT, right? That's something that exists in a number of office portfolios that we've been working with, where they already have reservable conference rooms with high-end AV and IT, but that's become a bit more of a focus of some of these tenant decision makers as well, just given that folks are all around. Instead of renting hotel space for a conference where we have folks very socially distanced, having something like that in the property with good connectivity. So when it comes to reopening safely and securely, this is our last slide, and then we'll jump into Q&A. We're updating this quite a bit in our phase 2 study, just because we are looking at more properties and portfolios wanting to reopen safely and securely, right? On the left there, you'll see that about 53% of our respondents said that they would modify the design of their space to accommodate social distancing. And some of those top changes were reducing the numbers of bullpen desks and cubes, splitting your larger offices, reducing the size of their lobby. So having a smaller lobby so that folks aren't necessarily gathering there constantly, filtering traffic through the office a bit more effectively. And then on the right, you'll see this was asked, you could select multiple options here for social distancing strategies. Universal mask wearing in the workplace was one of the top, a staggered return schedule. So essential employees first, followed by the less essential, and then enforcing occupancy limits in common spaces. Less popular things were at the bottom there, overtime or hazard pay, dividing company into A-B teams. We've heard from a lot of our clients in commercial real estate that some companies are dividing into A and B teams and coming back on staggered schedules, but this is not something that these respondents, that these tenant decision makers want to be mandated on them in order to return to the building. So it's more providing some of these ideas on the right as a list of best practices. So that's our presentation for today. We're happy to answer your questions. I've tried to include some of the trends that we're seeing in our phase 2 study. Again, I would say that what we're seeing in that phase 2 study is even more transformative views, even more reassessing their space needs, right? But I would say that a lot of these folks, there's a moment of opportunity where they're not necessarily going to not renew their leases, but they do want to open those negotiations and understand how they can better utilize their space. And so commercial portfolios, commercial property owners and operators that set themselves out as the experts in space utilization during coronavirus definitely stand to make this a bit of a moment of opportunity to build some more of that stickiness and loyalty with their existing customers. Mike, do you have any comments? Jerry?
No, I'm good. I would love to open it up to questions and field any questions that may be asked.
Before we get to the questions, I want to thank Michael and Kevin of Brightline Strategies here for joining us today and providing us this in-depth information. We have a round of applause for them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Incredible work, guys.
Yeah. And I saw that one question came in, and Jerry, I'm not sure if you wanted to navigate the questions. I'm happy to read some of them and answer them as they come in.
Samantha, do you have audio? Yeah. Do you have the question?
Okay, everyone can hear me, okay? The question that I see is, how are organizations handling new employees and communicating culture as they navigate remote working?
Yeah, so Mike, do you want to handle it?
I'll start, and Kevin, you can certainly jump in. I think one of the primary concerns, obviously, of working from home is how does an organization maintain and build its culture that really makes those enterprises uniquely them, right? And that is everything from onboarding new employees to maintaining the engagement of your existing workforce. One of the things that we're hearing, and we heard a lot of this in the qualitative research in advance of the nationwide study that Kevin referred to as our phase 2 studies, one of the things that we've been hearing from various owners and decision makers within commercial enterprise is that they start to view office space differently. In other words, they all recognize that there is a dramatic need to bring people together, engage with people, create those moments of interaction and engagement, but do so utilizing the space differently. I mean, one of the interesting balancing elements that we've heard was that the reduction of like physical office environments, what I mean by that is like private offices that Kevin was referring to earlier, and moving the space into more of a environment for pure collaboration because of the need of engaging people together. But the production of work, particularly within professional services organizations, we're starting to see a lot of responses, both in the qualitative research and other conversations we've had, where people are moving away from what I'll call the old think about having to have work production have to be done in the office, whereas work collaboration should really be what's being done in the office. And that's where I think the biggest demand and engagement is happening. Obviously, in some cases, there's the ability to bring people in. In other markets, they're not able to do so yet. So it is a mixed bag. Everybody is using the technology platforms that are out there, but that is one of the growing concerns among business owners and decision makers. How do I preserve my culture in a time where I can't actually put my people together? And you're starting to see all sorts of platforms being developed, what I'll call workplace experience platforms, that are really trying to engage people in different ways, from educational programming to the happiness factors to all sorts of different offers that perhaps historically would not have been present because of the ability to interact one-on-one. But now, as we are working remotely, there needs to be some connective tissue. And so people are looking for owners and operators of real estate to provide those catalysts of engagement through online platforms and other technology offerings to bring those people together, even if it is still virtually. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We in advance of doing this phase 2 study, we spoke with I think it was an SVP of real estate at a Fortune 100 firm who mentioned that when he's now bringing on new employees, he's having them over to his backyard to essentially onboard them and keep socially distanced. And what I thought about that first off is that contributes to that idea I said earlier that Gen Z and millennial folks are looking for that in-person interaction for mentorship and rising up in their firms. If there was a way that some of the commercial owners and operators could provide a larger space like that, or an outdoor patio where you could still, accomplish that, but still within the on property essentially, or close to the enterprise's headquarters, that would be beneficial. Just as a shout out to my girlfriend, she has been facilitating numerous cocktail classes for large companies where, they do virtual happy hours where they learn 2 to 3 cocktails, the history of mixology, et cetera. So a lot of companies are finding different ways to do it. I think the way for commercial owners and operators to accomplish that would be to have some sort of outdoor patio, nature lounge, or space for new employees to come and actually be on site, at least, not necessarily in the backyard of one of the executives, or provide some of that larger auditorium or training space where folks can keep some of that distance and not necessarily go in the confines of the office suite itself. But great question.
Thank you. I'm going to open up to any live attendees here that have questions. Pat, Wolf?
First of all, thank you so much. The information is really valuable. Michael, you had indicated that companies are looking to maybe bring their employees back for collaboration, not necessarily production. But how much is lost when that younger employee can't walk by another employee's desk and ask that quick question? Or over here, how another employee might be talking with a client That's more work production versus collaboration, and how much is lost when we're working from home, and maybe if the new model is just bringing back staff to collaborate versus produce work, is that way to learn going to be harder to identify and to put into operation?
Michael, could you hear that question?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm reminded of many years ago when I was still working in politics before I started Brightline. And I remember doing a fundraising letter, which began with, I think it said the Chinese symbol for crisis is a combination of danger and opportunity. And when you think about, and I know it's ironic that we find ourselves where we are, and I just referenced a Chinese symbol. However, I will say that I think you're starting to see people think a little differently. I mean, one of the interesting things we asked in the nationwide study was when you think about what is the most valuable attribute, if you will, of an office environment, is it really the production of work, or is it really the cohesiveness and collaboration and engagement of people working together towards a common end or common set of goals and results? And you start to see that the collaboration factor, like being able to talk to your colleague about either a client or a project or how to approach a particular issue, that tends to fall more under the collaboration side of the house than it does what I'll call the production of work. Now, again, obviously it differs by industry, but I'm just focusing right now for the purpose of discussion on professional services for a minute. And you're starting to see that, look, we still need the ability to bring people together for mentorship, for professional growth and development. So there is a widespread recognition that virtual environments do not replace one-on-one interactions or group interactions, which is great news for the office environment, right? However, what they're looking for to enable that engagement and that collaboration may be a little different going forward than the way we typically think of it. I think, crisis drives innovation and different ways of thinking. And we could find ourselves in this inflection point where the emergence of a new normal in terms of what offices look like, why they exist, how that space is used, both in terms of the traditional ways we think about it, but also the way we engage employees and onboard employees and support that collaboration is critical going forward, as it is historically. But I think you're going to see a change, and I think you're going to see people becoming more reliant on smaller group settings for that collaboration and mentorship than larger group settings. I think you're going to see an encouragement of online tools. It's funny, I used to yell at a lot of my folks when they would be in offices next to each other, yet they would be on their computers with GChat talking to each other. And I would always say, get out of your chair, walk into your colleague's office and have a conversation. Isn't it ironic now that we find ourselves in the very opposite dynamic, and people are becoming, myself included, more accepting of that virtual engagement than I was 7 months ago pre-pandemic? And I think you're going to see that movement shift over time. Kevin, I don't know if you have.
Yeah, very briefly, I thought it was a great question, Pat, and good ideas there, Mike. I think, one thing we tested, and, bringing personal experience in the survey world, my college alumni group, I'm a big volunteer for my college, and they equipped all of us with Zoom enterprise accounts in order to arrange alumni virtual events. And I thought that was fantastic. And I tested it in the survey. Could commercial owners and operators actually offer enterprise Zoom subscriptions to their tenants to facilitate those virtual connections, right? That did not perform well. But Pat, your question about productivity versus culture, I think is important, because I think that if portfolio owners and operators and those property managers can position themselves as resources on what you can actually do to to continue with productivity. So maybe it's not Zoom enterprise subscriptions, but introducing them to Slack and other technologies that exist to facilitate some of that remote productivity. That might have tested better if we looked at Slack as, enterprise Slack subscriptions as opposed to Zoom. But I think, again, being those resources and saying culture is super important. We want to bring you back as safely and efficiently as possible, but also here are some resources for you in the meantime. I think positioning yourselves as experts in that definitely bodes well for the industry as a whole.
For Michael and Kevin, I appreciate everything you've shared with us today. I think for respect to people's time here, we need to cut it off. We're running into overtime already. So again, thank you so much for sharing these findings with us. And for those that are here live and online on Zoom, we will be posting this original April study on that same spdatasource.org website through St. Paul Boma, or if you have trouble finding that, contact our St. Paul Boma office, and they'll direct you to the proper link on that. But it's just a unique study that we're just grateful for you're able to share that with us and assemble that information. We look forward to the next phase when that gets announced here. So thank you again for your time today and sharing that information with us. That takes us to our November meeting next month, which I think Michael and Kevin may want to join us at, because we're going to be collaborating with Minneapolis Boma for a rather unique event. We're going to have Henry Chamberlain, the CEO and president, chair of the board of Boma International, joining us via Zoom, who's going to give us an update on the strategic overview of commercial real estate, present and future, as well as an update on federal and state legislation that impacts the real estate industry, commercial real estate, as well as a recap of the election. It's going to be 6 days after the election, I believe, give or take. So register today for the November 11th special meeting. If you wonder if Boma in advocacy has any success, I was able to go to Washington, D.C. with the winter business meetings and our annual visit to Capitol Hill. And together with the Minneapolis Boma team, we went to every one of our state legislators' offices, or U.S. rep and senators' offices, and petitioned for some real estate issues. And some of those actually got passed in the stimulus bills that got passed earlier this year for the positive impact on the real estate industry. So Henry's going to give us an update on that. And with that, that concludes our meeting. So thank you very much for being with us today, and enjoy the rest of your week, and vote early, vote often. Thank you. Thanks again, Michael and Kevin.
Our pleasure. Thanks for the time.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Nice work, Samantha. Worked well, didn't it?